The stillness of the night was shattered by the piercing ring of a phone. On the other end of the line was a voice laced with fear, frantic, unsteady, and desperate. Anthony Napolitano's hands trembled as he dialed, his mind racing with unsettling thoughts. His sister, Susan Ambrosino, was missing. She had left her home earlier that evening, saying she had an important meeting. No further details, no explanation, just a vague mention of seeing someone. Hours passed. Messages went unanswered. Calls rang until they went straight to voicemail. At first it had seemed like a simple delay, perhaps a change of plans. But as the clock crept past midnight, worry turned into dread. By the time Anthony called the authorities, panic had taken over. His voice cracked as he recounted the last known details. Susan, 26 years old, 4 months pregnant, had vanished without a trace. The dispatcher calmly noted the information, but there was an underlying weight to the call. A missing person report wasn't unusual, but something about this case felt wrong. There was no history of Susan abruptly disappearing, no indication that she would have willingly cut off contact with her family. The circumstances demanded urgency. As officers arrived at Susan's residence, the eerie silence within the home was suffocating. A warm coffee mug sat on the kitchen counter, untouched. The television remote lay on the armrest of the couch, as if placed there only moments before she had left. There were no signs of forced entry, no immediate indications of foul play, just a home that had been abruptly abandoned. Outside, a neighbor stepped forward with a hesitant expression. He had seen something, but at the time, it hadn't seemed unusual enough to question. He recounted that around the time Susan had left, he had noticed a dark-colored vehicle parked near her house. He couldn't make out who was inside, but he had seen her getting into the car willingly. The detail was chilling. If she had left voluntarily, who was she meeting? And why had she never returned? Her car was nowhere in sight. A check of recent credit card transactions showed no unusual activity. No purchases, no withdrawals, no trail leading to where she might have gone. The phone records would take time to process, but officers immediately flagged the case as suspicious. A woman, pregnant and alone, does not simply disappear without leaving a single clue behind. The next step was to reach out to the people closest to Susan, her family, her friends, anyone who might have known her plans for the evening. One name stood out among them, Keith Ambrosino, her ex-husband. They had separated, but there had been no history of violence or bitter disputes. Still, ex-partners are always a point of interest in cases like these. When questioned, Keith's response was one of genuine shock. He hadn't spoken to Susan in days and had no knowledge of where she might have gone. His reaction seemed authentic, but police knew better than to rely solely on emotion. They noted his statement, but didn't rule out the possibility of deeper tensions between them. Then there was another name, one that hadn't surfaced immediately, but would soon become central to the case: Stephen Schiavone. Stephen was Keith's half-brother. Initially, there was no reason to consider him relevant, but subtle inconsistencies in the statements given by Susan's family and friends raised questions. Someone had mentioned that Susan had recently been in contact with him. Someone else recalled that there had been tension between them. It was a name worth investigating further. As officers pieced together the initial framework of the case, they could feel the weight of something dark pressing down on them. Missing person cases often followed predictable patterns, but this one felt different. The absence of immediate evidence, the abruptness of Susan's disappearance, and the strange gaps in information all pointed to something more sinister. And then, less than 12 hours after the investigation began, a break came in the case, one that turned speculation into something far more alarming. A patrol unit, searching for any sign of Susan's car, came across an abandoned vehicle in a desolate lot. The engine was cold, the doors locked. It matched the description of her car. The location, miles from her home, raised even more questions. Why would she be here? Who had driven the car to this place? The area was searched carefully, the officers' flashlights cutting through the darkness. And then, lying a short distance from the car, they found something chilling: Susan's purse. Its contents were mostly intact, yet the phone was missing. No money had been taken. There were no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings suggesting a robbery. It was as if someone had purposefully left it there. a message, or perhaps a way to mislead. At that moment, the case was no longer just a missing person investigation. It was something far worse. Susan Ambrosino wasn't just missing, she was in danger. Susan Ambrosino's disappearance had already set the police on high alert, but the discovery of her abandoned car in an empty lot escalated the case to something far more concerning. It wasn't just the location that raised suspicion, it was the eerie state of the scene itself. The vehicle was locked, the doors untouched, as if placed there with careful intention. The purse found nearby was just as unsettling. It hadn't been thrown or scattered, no signs of a struggle. Instead, it seemed almost deliberately left behind, a quiet message waiting to be deciphered. The lot was a desolate patch of asphalt at the edge of an industrial area. The nearest streetlights were dim, offering only fragmented pools of light across the cracked pavement. Few people had reason to pass through, especially at night. Whoever had left Susan's car here likely knew that. The implications were chilling. This wasn't an impulsive crime. It had been planned. A team of forensic experts arrived, their movements deliberate and methodical as they secured the perimeter. The first officer on the scene noted the details. No visible damage to the car, no broken glass, no immediate signs of a struggle. But something felt wrong, an underlying disturbance that couldn't be ignored. When they finally gained access to the interior, the first thing they noticed was the seat. It was pushed farther back than Susan would have needed to drive comfortably, a small but crucial detail suggesting someone else had been behind the wheel last. The scent of the space was clean, too clean, yet a faint metallic trace lingered in the air. A quick forensic sweep confirmed what investigators already suspected. There was blood. Under the harsh glare of ultraviolet light, a small smear of blood was revealed on the passenger's seatbelt buckle. It was almost invisible to the naked eye, a single misstep in an otherwise controlled scene. It wasn't enough to indicate a violent struggle, but it was enough to prove that Susan had been bleeding inside that car. Outside, officers canvassed the surrounding area, questioning any potential witnesses. Few people were around at this hour, but one individual, a truck driver resting in his cab parked a few lots away, mentioned something strange. He had seen the car parked there the previous night, but hadn't noticed anyone around. The headlights had been off, the lot silent. It wasn't until much later, when he was dozing off, that he thought he saw another car pull in, its presence brief before it disappeared into the night. The details were vague, but it was another piece of the puzzle. Security cameras in the area were limited, but one across the street faced the lot at an angle. The footage would take time to retrieve, but detectives knew it could be critical. If another vehicle had been involved, it could mean Susan had met someone here. Had she come willingly? Had she been waiting for someone she trusted, only for the situation to turn deadly? Detectives moved quickly to piece together Susan's last known movements. Her friends and family were contacted, each one questioned about her recent behavior, her plans, anything that could explain what had led her to that parking lot. Most didn't have answers, only worry etched across their faces. But then one name surfaced: Stephen Schiavone. Susan's friends hesitated before revealing what little they knew. She hadn't spoken much about him, but there had been mentions, brief and uncertain. The connection was strange. Stephen wasn't just an acquaintance. He was her ex-husband's half-brother. That detail alone raised questions. Why had she been speaking with him? And had he been the one she was meeting that night? Investigators wasted no time reaching out. Stephen was contacted, asked to come in for questioning. He arrived at the station composed, cooperative, and yet there was something about his demeanor that felt rehearsed. He claimed he hadn't spoken to Susan recently. When asked when they last had contact, he hesitated slightly before responding. A few weeks ago, maybe? I don't really remember. The detectives let the lie settle in silence before moving forward. They already had Susan's phone records. The last call she made had been to Stephen. It had lasted just under 5 minutes. Why would he lie about something so simple? Rather than confronting him immediately, investigators let him speak, listening carefully to the way he answered each question. Did Susan seem worried about anything? Had she mentioned meeting anyone? He responded with vague indifference, offering nothing of value. The interview ended without incident, but Stephen's name was now underlined in bold. The contradictions were stacking up, and while he might have thought he was in control of the conversation, The detectives knew better. Hours later, the forensic report came in. The blood on the seatbelt buckle matched Susan's DNA. But that wasn't all. Traces of another person's DNA had been recovered from the steering wheel. It was male. A match hadn't been confirmed yet, but the implications were obvious. At the same time, the surveillance footage from the lot was finally retrieved. Investigators gathered in a dimly lit room, eyes fixed on the grainy black and white images as the time-stamped footage played. At 9:47 p.m., Susan's car appeared, pulling into the lot and parking in one of the farthest corners. She had driven herself there. At 9:52 p.m., another vehicle entered the frame, dark-colored. The resolution made it difficult to identify the make or model, but there was no doubt. It had pulled in directly behind Susan's car. A figure stepped out. The footage was too unclear to capture facial details, but the body language suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing. They moved toward Susan's car, lingering there. The angle wasn't perfect, but it was enough to tell that Susan had still been inside when they approached. At 10:04 p.m., the second vehicle drove away, and Susan Ambrosino was never seen again. This was no random disappearance, no last-minute decision to run away. Someone had met her there that night, and minutes later, she was gone. Detectives now had two pressing tasks: identify the second vehicle and find out exactly how Stephen Schiavone fit into all of this. Because one thing was clear: he had lied. The discovery of Susan Ambrosino's car had shifted the investigation into high gear. Every piece of evidence found inside and around the vehicle pointed towards something sinister. It wasn't just a case of a missing woman anymore. It was beginning to look like something far worse. The presence of her purse, the small smear of blood on the seatbelt buckle, and the unsettling placement of the car in an abandoned lot. These weren't random. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure that Susan disappeared, leaving just enough behind to mislead. As investigators awaited the forensic analysis of the unknown male DNA found on the steering wheel, they returned to the one person who had already raised more questions than answers: Stephen Schiavone. His statement had been riddled with inconsistencies, his demeanor too controlled, his denial of speaking to Susan on the night of her disappearance proven false within hours. He had lied. The only question was, how deeply was he involved? The detectives reviewing the surveillance footage knew what they had seen. At 9:47 p.m., Susan had arrived at the parking lot alone. 5 minutes later, another vehicle followed. The figure that emerged from the dark-colored sedan had moved with precision, approaching Susan's car and staying there for several minutes. The angle was poor, the image quality grainy, but it was clear that whoever was standing outside Susan's driver's side door knew her. And then, at 10:04 p.m., that vehicle had driven away. What happened during those 17 minutes? Forensics had confirmed the blood in Susan's car was hers. It wasn't enough to suggest a struggle, but it was enough to suggest something had gone wrong. More troubling was the secondary DNA profile lifted from the steering wheel. It was male, and it wasn't a match to Keith Ambrosino, her ex-husband, which meant someone else had driven that car. Investigators worked fast to pull additional footage from traffic cameras in the vicinity, hoping to track the mystery vehicle's movements before and after it left the parking lot. But even without confirmation, the weight of suspicion was already pressing down on Stephen. His phone records showed calls between him and Susan in the days leading up to her disappearance. More damning, there was a 5-minute call between them just before she had vanished. Had it been a coincidence? Or had that call been the final conversation between a woman unknowingly walking into danger and the person who had orchestrated it? As detectives moved through their timeline, a forensic analyst entered the precinct carrying a report. The second DNA profile from the steering wheel had returned a match. It belonged to Stephen Schiavone. The detectives barely exchanged glances before moving to retrieve Stephen for further questioning. This time, there would be no room for vague answers or careful omissions. When he arrived, his demeanor was the same as before: calm, cooperative, almost too at ease given the circumstances. But this time, he was up against irrefutable forensic evidence. When asked again about the last time he had seen Susan, he stuck to his previous answer. He hadn't spoken to her. He hadn't seen her. A detective placed a folder on the table between them. Without opening it, he stated plainly, "We found your DNA in her car." A long pause filled the room. the kind that stretches just a little too long. A flicker of something crossed Stephen's face. Not panic, not outright fear, but something closer to calculation. Then he exhaled sharply and leaned back. Okay, he admitted. Maybe I did see her. But it was nothing. We just talked for a few minutes. His adjustment of the story wasn't unexpected. Suspects rarely fold immediately. The key was to keep them talking, to push them into a corner until they had nowhere left to go but the truth. "We know you were in the car," one detective said, watching Stephen carefully. "We know you were the last person to see her." Stephen ran a hand down his face. "I didn't do anything to her." It wasn't a denial of involvement, just a carefully worded distinction. With each passing minute, his story was unraveling. He had claimed he hadn't seen Susan in weeks. That had already been proven false. Now he had to admit he had been with her that night. He had been inside her car. He had touched the steering wheel. So what else had he done? Investigators pressed further, asking why Susan had called him that night, why she had met him in that empty parking lot, why she had never come home. Stephen's answers were vague, contradictory. At times, he claimed she had been fine when he left. Other times, he hinted at an argument, but insisted she had been alive and well when he drove away. It was a shifting story, unstable under scrutiny. Meanwhile, the forensic team was still combing through Susan's vehicle for anything they might have missed. The blood smear had already provided crucial confirmation that Susan had been injured inside the car. But it wasn't the only thing they found. There was something else. A small piece of torn fabric lodged in the space between the passenger seat and the door. It was dark in color, almost black. A match was pending, but detectives knew that if they could trace it back to Stephen, or the clothes he had worn that night, it would be another nail in the coffin. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear that Susan hadn't just disappeared. Something had happened to her that night, and whatever it was, Stephen Schiavone knew the truth. Detectives weren't working under the assumption that they were looking for a missing woman anymore. They were looking for a body, and they were running out of time to find her. The investigation had reached a critical juncture. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the full picture was still obscured by unanswered questions, half-truths, and a suspect whose story was unraveling at the seams. Detectives no longer believed they were dealing with a missing person. Every shred of evidence, both forensic and circumstantial, pointed to something far more sinister. Susan Ambrosino was not just gone. She had met with foul play, and Stephen Schiavone was at the center of it all. He had already been caught in multiple lies. His initial claim of not having spoken to Susan in weeks was disproven by phone records, which showed a call between them shortly before she vanished. His insistence that he hadn't seen her on the night of her disappearance had been obliterated by the discovery of his DNA on the steering wheel of her car. Now detectives were closing in on him, tightening the noose with each passing hour. But lying wasn't a crime. Lying wasn't murder. If they wanted to build an airtight case, they needed more. Forensics continued its meticulous work, dissecting every inch of Susan's vehicle in search of something definitive. The blood on the seatbelt buckle had already confirmed that she had been injured inside the car, but there was no way to determine the extent of that injury, at least not yet. Then, in a seemingly insignificant crevice, wedged between the passenger seat and the door, a tiny piece of torn fabric was found. It was dark, almost black, and frayed at the edges, as if it had been caught and pulled loose in a struggle. It was bagged as evidence and sent for analysis. The hope was that it would match a piece of clothing belonging to Stephen, something that would place him inside the car at the time of the incident, in a way that couldn't be explained away. Meanwhile, detectives focused on breaking down his inconsistencies. They knew that the best way to catch a liar was to let them talk, to let them entangle themselves in their own web of deception. Stephen was brought back in for another round of questioning. This time, he was greeted with a different atmosphere. The officers weren't casual. They weren't giving him space to maneuver. The time for subtlety was over. They laid out the evidence: the phone call, the DNA, the blood, the surveillance footage. Piece by piece, they built the timeline before him, watching his reactions closely. He remained composed at first, but when confronted with the DNA match, his mask of indifference cracked. His lips tightened. His fingers curled slightly. "We know you were in her car, Stephen." The silence stretched. He exhaled slowly. "Okay, fine. I was there," he admitted, as if revealing something trivial. "I met her. We talked. But that's all." It was a small admission, but it was significant. It meant he was abandoning his earlier lie. It meant he was willing to shift his story just enough to account for the evidence they had. But only just enough. "What did you talk about?" Stephen hesitated. "It was about the baby," he said finally. The baby. For the first time, he acknowledged it. Detectives already knew Susan was pregnant. They had known for days. What they didn't know was whether Stephen had been aware. His admission confirmed that he had been. But had that knowledge been a motive? Susan had spoken to close friends about her pregnancy. She had been excited. She had wanted the baby. But what about the father? And more importantly, who was the father? Detectives didn't pose the question immediately. They let it sit in the air, unspoken but heavy. Instead, they pressed on, asking what happened after the conversation. Stephen's answers were mechanical, rehearsed. "She was upset. She wanted to talk more, but I had to leave." "So you left her there?" "Yes." "Alive?" Stephen blinked. "Yes, of course." The next question was just as measured. "What happened to your clothes from that night?" There it was, the subtle shift in body language, the flicker of uncertainty in his gaze. He recovered quickly, but it had been there. "I don't know," he said after a beat. "Laundry, I guess." Detectives weren't convinced. His reaction had given them something to work with. The analysis of the torn fabric found in Susan's car was still pending, but if it matched any clothing Stephen had owned, it would be another damning link in the chain. Meanwhile, the forensic team had returned to Susan's car for another round of examination. They had already found blood. They had already found fabric. Now they found something else. A single fingerprint, faint but intact, on the inside of the passenger side door handle. A fingerprint that did not belong to Susan. It was lifted carefully, run through the system, and within hours, confirmed to belong to Stephen Schiavone. It was another contradiction, another lie exposed. If Stephen had only spoken to Susan from outside the car, if he had never been inside with her, how could his fingerprint be there? With mounting evidence against him, detectives shifted focus to another crucial aspect of the investigation. Where was Susan? They weren't just trying to prove a crime had been committed. They were trying to find a missing woman, or, as they increasingly suspected, a body. Detectives knew they needed a search area. They studied cell tower data, trying to trace the movement of Susan's phone after she disappeared. It was a slow, grueling process, but then a break. A final ping from Susan's phone, hours after she had vanished. Not near her home, not near the parking lot where her car had been found, but near an isolated stretch of land on the outskirts of the city, a place that had no reason to be significant, unless someone had left her there. The search team was mobilized immediately. By now, detectives weren't looking for a missing woman. They were looking for a grave. The shift in the investigation had been inevitable. What began as a missing person case had now transitioned into something far more grave. Susan Ambrosino was no longer presumed missing. She was presumed dead. And now the objective wasn't just to find her, but to locate her remains and bring whoever was responsible for her disappearance to justice. Every shred of evidence gathered so far had pointed in one direction. The surveillance footage had shown her meeting someone at the parking lot that night. The forensic evidence inside her car had placed Stephen Schiavone at the scene, despite his repeated denials. His DNA on the steering wheel, his fingerprint on the passenger door handle, and the small smear of her blood near the seatbelt buckle all told a story. One that didn't align with the version he had given. But proving someone was in a car was one thing. Proving they were involved in a crime was another. As investigators pieced together what had happened to Susan in those final moments, they turned their attention to the last known signal from her cell phone. The ping had come from a remote area on the outskirts of the city, a stretch of land rarely traveled except by those who had a reason to be there. The signal had remained stationary for hours before the phone either died or was turned off. That meant one of two things. Either Susan had been there, or someone who had possession of her phone had. A search team was dispatched before dawn, combing through the location where the signal had last been traced. The terrain was rough, overgrown brush, patches of dirt roads that led nowhere, and an unsettling quiet that seemed to swallow sound. If someone had wanted to dispose of evidence, to erase any trace of an event that should never have happened, this was the kind of place they would choose. As officers moved carefully through the area, forensic specialists followed closely behind, scanning the ground for anything out of place. A misplaced rock, freshly disturbed earth, a discarded object that didn't belong, anything could be a lead. They worked methodically, knowing that if Susan had been brought here, the truth was buried somewhere beneath their feet. Hours passed with little progress. The weight of uncertainty grew heavier. Then one of the officers stopped, his eyes locked on something partially hidden beneath a tangle of branches. He crouched down, brushed away the debris, and found what they had been hoping for, but dreading at the same time. A piece of fabric, dark in color, torn at the edges. It was similar in texture and color to the small scrap found in Susan's car, the one caught between the seat and the door. This was a match. The scene was immediately cordoned off, and a more detailed search began. If her clothing was here, then she had been here. And if she had been here, then so had her killer. Forensic specialists continued their sweep, digging into the earth carefully, analyzing every inch of ground within a 10-foot radius. Minutes passed, then hours. The quiet hum of their movements was the only sound that filled the air. And then, at last, something more. A second officer, stationed several feet away, called for assistance. His voice carried a weight of urgency that sent the team running. When they reached him, they saw what had stopped him cold. The ground, slightly uneven, freshly turned in places. Not obvious at first glance, but under closer inspection, unmistakable. A shallow grave. Excavation began immediately, and within minutes the team uncovered the first sign of what they had been looking for. The undeniable evidence that Susan had been here and that she had never left. The smell of decomposition was faint but distinct, the kind that sent an immediate chill down the spine of even the most seasoned investigators. It didn't take long before they confirmed what they already suspected. The body was there. Susan Ambrosino had been found. And now the case was no longer about finding answers. It was about seeking justice. The discovery of Susan Ambrosino's body shifted the entire investigation into a new phase. What had once been an urgent search for a missing person was now officially a homicide investigation. Her remains, buried in a shallow grave on the outskirts of the city, were damning proof that someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she would never be found. But they had failed. Detectives had their prime suspect. They had the evidence that tied him to the crime scene. But now they needed something more. They needed to know exactly how she died. Within hours of her body being recovered, a full forensic team arrived at the site. The area was methodically documented, every inch of disturbed ground carefully examined before Susan's remains were removed for autopsy. The medical examiner wasted no time, knowing that the condition of the body would provide critical answers. Answers that could solidify a conviction or reveal new layers to an already tangled case. Susan had been missing for days, but the cool February weather had slowed decomposition. Her body was largely intact, preserving valuable forensic details. The first thing investigators noted was the presence of a single gunshot wound to the head. A close-range execution, methodical and deliberate. The bullet had entered just above her left ear, exiting cleanly on the opposite side. The angle suggested she had been shot either while sitting or kneeling, likely unable to move when the fatal shot was fired. This was not an accident. This was an execution. Further examination revealed bruising along her wrists and upper arms, indicative of restraint. She had likely been held against her will before she was killed, the bruises forming as she struggled. The ligature marks suggested she had been bound at some point, though whatever had been used was no longer present at the scene. There was also one more disturbing detail. Susan had been 4 months pregnant. That fact had already been established from her medical records, but now the medical examiner could confirm that the pregnancy had not been a factor in her death. There were no injuries to her abdomen, no signs that the killer had specifically targeted her unborn child. This wasn't about the pregnancy itself. This was about eliminating Susan. As the forensic team completed their initial findings, detectives began compiling the final chain of evidence against Stephen Schiavone. The physical proof was overwhelming. His DNA was inside Susan's car. His fingerprint was found on the passenger door handle. The last known call Susan made before her disappearance was to him. And now, the most damning of all, her body had been dumped in a location far from her usual routes, in a manner that suggested premeditation. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Stephen had planned this, but one crucial detail remained unclear. Why? Motive was the last missing piece, and investigators needed to nail it down before moving forward with an arrest. Detectives turned their attention to the psychological aspect of the crime: the execution-style shooting, the restraint marks, the carefully concealed burial. These were not the actions of someone who had killed in the heat of the moment. This was calculated, and that meant something had triggered it. They knew Stephen and Susan had spoken about the baby on the night she disappeared. They knew she had wanted to keep it. But had that conversation been the breaking point? To answer that, they needed to find out who else knew about Susan's pregnancy and what impact that revelation had on those around her. The focus of the investigation expanded, pulling in interviews with Susan's closest friends and family. Had she confided in anyone about difficulties with the father? Had she expressed concerns about someone not wanting the child? And then, a breakthrough. One of Susan's closest friends, hesitant at first, finally spoke up. She recalled a conversation Susan had just a few weeks before she vanished. A conversation where Susan admitted she was scared, not about the pregnancy itself, but about what would happen if the wrong person found out. Susan had confided that she had been speaking to someone privately about the baby, trying to work out what to do. She had said that not everyone was happy about the news. That was the missing motive. Someone hadn't wanted that baby to be born. Someone had wanted to erase that reality entirely. And Susan had paid the price. Detectives had enough. The forensic proof, the inconsistencies in Stephen's statements, the surveillance footage, and now a clear motive tied to the pregnancy. There was no more room for doubt. It was time to make an arrest. The moment had arrived. Every hour spent piecing together Susan Ambrosino's last moments, every forensic test, every inconsistency in Stephen Schiavone's statements. It had all led to this. The arrest warrant was signed, the team briefed, and the strategy finalized. They weren't just bringing in a suspect. They were taking down a murderer. Stephen had carefully constructed his alibi, one that had initially placed him nowhere near Susan on the night of her disappearance. He had claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks, that their last conversation had been casual, that he had no idea what had happened to her. But reality had dismantled his lies piece by piece. The phone records proved he had spoken to her just before she vanished. The DNA on her steering wheel placed him in her car. The surveillance footage showed a dark sedan, matching the one he drove, pulling into the lot just minutes after Susan arrived. The blood in the vehicle confirmed she had been hurt before she was killed. And now, with the discovery of her body, the truth was undeniable. Susan had not simply disappeared. She had been silenced. Detectives prepared for resistance. Suspects react in one of three ways when confronted with their crimes: fight, flee, or feign innocence. They didn't know which approach Stephen would take, but they were ready for all possibilities. It was late afternoon when they arrived at his residence. The neighborhood was quiet, an ordinary suburban street with manicured lawns and neatly parked cars. The illusion of normalcy stood in stark contrast to the reason for their presence. This was the home of a man who had been living with the weight of a murder. They moved in carefully, 2 officers stationed at the back in case he attempted to run, another positioned near his vehicle. The lead detectives approached the front door, their hands steady as they knocked firmly. Seconds passed, then the sound of movement inside. Stephen opened the door, his expression shifting in an instant, from casual indifference to something more guarded. He was caught off guard, but not entirely surprised. He had known this moment was coming. The walls had been closing in, the questions becoming more pointed, the evidence stacking higher against him. "Stephen Schiavone," one of the detectives said, voice firm but controlled. "You're under arrest for the murder of Susan Ambrosino." For a brief moment, Stephen didn't move. His jaw tightened, his eyes scanning their faces as if searching for an escape. Then, before he could say a word, the officer stepped forward. His hands were pulled behind his back, the cold steel of the handcuffs snapping shut around his wrists. A routine recitation followed, the familiar words of Miranda rights, the declaration that anything he said could and would be used against him in court. Stephen remained silent, his body rigid, his expression unreadable. But silence could only last so long. At the station, the interrogation room was sterile and impersonal, designed to break down psychological barriers. A simple table, two chairs, no distractions, nowhere to retreat. Stephen sat across from the detectives, his posture stiff, his gaze unwavering. He knew the game. He had likely played scenarios over in his mind, convincing himself that if he just maintained his innocence, if he denied everything, maybe, just maybe, he could walk away from this. But the game was already over. One of the detectives placed a stack of documents in front of him. Photos of the evidence collected so far, a picture of Susan's abandoned car, a close-up of the blood smear on the seatbelt buckle, a frame from the surveillance footage showing the second vehicle, and finally a photograph of Susan's shallow grave. Stephen's expression didn't change, but his fingers twitched slightly. A subtle, almost imperceptible reaction, but one that didn't go unnoticed. "We have your DNA in her car," one detective said, tone even but firm. "We have surveillance footage of a car just like yours at the scene. We have phone records that put you in contact with her the night she disappeared." A pause. "And now we have her body." Stephen didn't respond. "The evidence is overwhelming," the detective continued. "This is your last chance to tell the truth." Still, no answer. But silence wasn't a confession. It wasn't a conviction. They needed more. The forensic report on the fabric fragment found in Susan's car was finalized. It was a match to a jacket owned by Stephen, a dark-colored zip-up hoodie that he had been seen wearing in the weeks before Susan's disappearance. Investigators had already confiscated the garment from his home, and now forensic analysis confirmed that fibers from that exact jacket had been found in the crime scene. It was yet another link in an unbreakable chain. The evidence was overwhelming, and yet Stephen refused to break. It was an arrogance that was common among certain types of offenders. The belief that they could outsmart the system, that if they just kept their mouths shut, they could somehow navigate their way out of a situation that had already sealed their fate. But the justice system wasn't about confessions. It was about proof, and they had enough. Stephen would be charged with first-degree murder. The case was moving forward. The air in the courthouse was heavy with expectation. The case had captured attention beyond just the community. It had become a symbol of justice for a woman who never had the chance to fight for herself. The prosecution had spent months preparing for this moment, knowing that despite the overwhelming forensic evidence, no conviction was ever guaranteed. 12 jurors, each carrying their own perspectives, biases, and interpretations of the law, held the fate of Stephen Schiavone in their hands. He entered the courtroom dressed sharply, clean-shaven, presenting an image of control. He had not spoken since his arrest, refusing interviews, declining to cooperate beyond the required legal process. Some defendants crumbled under pressure, others displayed false remorse, but Stephen had done neither. He sat stiffly beside his attorneys, a mask of neutrality covering whatever turmoil, if any, stirred beneath the surface. The prosecution knew their case was solid. They had the DNA, the fingerprints, the cell phone data, and the surveillance footage. But trials were rarely decided by facts alone. Juries responded to narrative, to how well the prosecution could weave evidence into a story that left no doubt. They needed to convince, not just prove. The lead prosecutor addressed the jury with calculated precision. The opening statement was not long, nor overly dramatic. It was simple, direct, and laced with the cold truth. This case is about control, about a man who feared the consequences of his actions so much that he made the ultimate decision, to erase them entirely. Susan Ambrosino was not a threat. She was not a danger to anyone. The only thing she did was exist, and for that she was murdered. You will hear the evidence. You will see the proof. And when you have heard it all, you will know, without any doubt, that Stephen Schiavone is guilty. The defense remained composed, their strategy clear from the beginning. They would not argue that Susan's death was not a tragedy. They would not deny that Stephen had known her, or even that he had been in her car. What they would do, what they needed to do, was plant seeds of uncertainty. They would challenge the chain of evidence, question the accuracy of forensic collection, and attempt to introduce other possibilities. They did not need to prove Stephen was innocent. They only needed to create reasonable doubt. The first testimony came from Susan's closest friends and family. They described her as a woman with no reason to vanish, someone who had been excited for the future despite the challenges she faced. She had not been running. She had not been in distress. She had planned for her child, prepared to embrace motherhood, and most crucially, she had expressed fear, not for herself, but for the reaction of the man who had fathered her unborn baby. The medical examiner took the stand next. The room was silent as the jury listened to the unemotional, clinical recounting of the manner of Susan's death. The evidence was indisputable. A single shot to the head, fired at close range. The kind of shot that suggested intent, not accident. She had bruises on her wrists, indicating restraint. The fetal remains confirmed that she had been pregnant, 4 months along, when she was killed. Then came the forensic evidence piece by piece. The blood smear inside her car, the DNA match on the steering wheel, the fingerprint on the passenger side door. The fiber sample from Stephen's hoodie found lodged in the seat. Each expert presented their findings, confirming the integrity of the evidence and dismantling any claim of contamination. But the most damning moment came when the surveillance footage was played in court. The grainy black and white video did not show faces, but it showed enough. It captured Susan's car pulling into the parking lot. It captured a second vehicle arriving minutes later. A figure stepping out, moving with certainty towards Susan's driver's side door. The second vehicle remained parked for 17 minutes. Then it left. And Susan was never seen alive again. The footage alone was circumstantial. But when placed alongside everything else, it was a keyhole view into the final minutes of Susan's life. The defense attempted to poke holes where they could. They questioned forensic handling, implying that transferred DNA could have led to false positives. They suggested an alternate suspect, arguing that Susan could have met someone else that night. They attempted to challenge the timeline, saying that while Stephen's phone had pinged near the parking lot, it did not prove he was the person in the surveillance footage. But with every counterpoint, the prosecution had an answer. If there was another suspect, the prosecutor stated, then where is their evidence? If there was an issue with the forensics, they continued, then why does every test confirm the same thing? If Stephen Schiavone did not kill Susan Ambrosino, then where was he? And why has he lied at every turn? Stephen watched the proceedings unfold with detached focus. He did not flinch when photos of Susan's remains were shown to the jury. He did not react when the prosecutor pointed at him directly, calling him out as a liar. He did not look away when the medical examiner described how long it would have taken Susan's body to decay in the cold winter ground. It was as if he had already accepted his fate, or perhaps he believed there was still a way out. The prosecution rested their case with confidence. The defense, however, was not finished. They had one last move to play, and it was coming next. The trial had stretched for weeks, dissecting every moment of Susan Ambrosino's last hours. Every interaction, every shred of forensic evidence. Now everything had come down to the jury's decision. 12 people, one verdict. Stephen Schiavone sat motionless as the jury returned to the courtroom. The deliberation had taken 2 days, long enough to weigh every fact, but not long enough to suggest hesitation. He had listened as both sides fought over his fate, presenting their arguments with unwavering conviction. But in the end, it wouldn't be the speeches or legal maneuvers that determined his future. It would be the truth. The foreman stood. The room was silent. We, the jury, find the defendant, Stephen Schiavone, guilty of first-degree murder. A ripple of emotion swept through the room, an exhale of relief from Susan's family, a murmur from the spectators, an almost imperceptible shift in Stephen's posture. He didn't protest. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He simply accepted it. At sentencing, the prosecution sought the maximum penalty. The murder had been premeditated. The victim had been pregnant. The crime had been calculated. There was no room for leniency. The defense, despite the inevitable outcome, attempted to argue for a lighter sentence, citing Stephen's lack of prior violent history and the possibility of rehabilitation. The judge saw through it. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a mistake. This was a deliberate act. one that stole the life of a woman and her unborn child. For that, you will spend no less than 30 years in prison, and it is the opinion of this court that you never see freedom again. The gavel struck. Stephen was led away. No breakdown. No last words. Only silence. Justice had been served. But in cases like this, justice is never enough. No sentence could ever bring Susan back. No punishment could undo what had been done. Her family would still wake up every day with a hole in their lives, a presence that should have been there, but never would be again. The real weight of this case wasn't just in the conviction. It was in the warning it left behind. Susan had been young, hopeful, and trusting. She had believed that she could navigate her circumstances, that she could work things out, that she could control the situation. But what she hadn't realized was that some people, when faced with responsibility, will do anything to escape it, even murder. This case wasn't just about one crime. It was about the dangers of silence. Susan had known fear before she died. She had confided in friends that she was worried, but she hadn't acted on that fear. How many women, how many people find themselves in situations where they sense danger but ignore it? How many believe that reason and patience will diffuse a situation that is already out of control? The truth is, violence doesn't always come from strangers. It often comes from those closest to us. People we trust, people we love, people we think could never hurt us. Susan's story is a reminder that when fear creeps in, when warning signs appear, they should never be dismissed. That speaking up, reaching out, and taking action can mean the difference between life and death. And for those who think they can bury their crimes, this case is proof that the truth will always surface. No matter how well they cover their tracks, no matter how carefully they plan, justice has a way of finding them. Susan Ambrosino's life was stolen, but in death, she still speaks. And because of that, her story will never be forgotten. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.